We're watching Press TV's news review, where we look deeper into some of the top stories of the day. On this segment of the program, a well-recognized face in U.S. politics has admitted to helping plan attempted foreign coups in unprecedented remarks, openly acknowledging Washington's role in stoking unrest in other countries. John Bolton was talking to CNN after a hearing of a congressional committee investigating last year's deadly attack on the Capitol building. The assault is seen as a culmination of an attempted coup orchestrated by ex-President Donald Trump in a bid to remain in power after losing the 2020 election. His national security advisor disagrees that Trump was competent to pull off a coup. Bolton has, however, acknowledged his own involvement in masterminding coups in other countries.
I do want to ask, one doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work.
I do want to ask a follow-up. When we were talking about what is capable, what you need to do to be able to plan a coup, and you cited your expertise having planned coups.
I'm not going to get into the specifics, but
successful coups?
Well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful. Not that we had all that much to do with it, but I saw what it took for an opposition to try and overturn an illegally elected president, and they failed.
In 2019, Bolton publicly supported Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido's call for the military to line up behind him to oust Nicolas Maduro, arguing that the president's re-election was fraudulent. The efforts, however, ended unsuccessfully. Many foreign policy experts have slammed Washington over its history of interventions in other countries. Joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have Director of Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies, Tim Anderson, who's with us from Sydney. Also, we have political analyst Barry Grossman joining us from Bali. Let's start off with Mr. Tim Anderson in Sydney, and let's jump right in there. What do you make of the recent comments made by John Bolton and the rather public confession on national television?
Well, we have to remember that John Bolton is part of the faction in Washington, which is sometimes called realists, sometimes Republicans, where they speak rather more openly about their interventions and wars and crimes overseas, as opposed to the liberal faction, which tries to put a nicer image on it of humanitarian intervention and human rights and so on. So Bolton, of course, was deeply responsible for the fabrication of evidence in relation to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. He was involved in the several attempts to have a coup in Venezuela. He was also, as ambassador to the UN, responsible for covering up the crimes of apartheid Israel, including the expansion of settlements and the massacre of Palestinians. There's a whole series of crimes that Bolton's been involved with, and this is not unique that he's admitting openly his involvement.
And Barry Grossman, give us your thoughts on what John Bolton just said.
Well, look, it's interesting to reflect on what he said and why he said it, because it certainly wasn't in any way directly germane to the issue being discussed, namely the January 6th protesters, which are now being characterized variously as people who engaged in a rebellion or even an attempted coup d'etat at President Trump's instigation. And it's important to remember that John Bolton, even though he's a leading neoconservative, he's very much a second-tier neocon, and I think that troubles him a lot. I think he would like to be thought of as one of the leading top-tier neocons, and he's not. So he makes these comments as if he sees it as a way to elevate himself and his importance, when in fact it doesn't do that. But as for the substance of what he said, I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. has a long, sordid history of being involved in orchestrating coups d'etats around the world. That in recent years, the last couple of decades, to be sure, the neocons have been very active in fomenting coup d'etats. We see the consequences of that right now in the Ukraine, for example. And so when he admits to having been involved in planning coup d'etats abroad, it's worth considering what was playing out when he was a senior member of the Trump administration. And while to be sure he was involved to some extent or another in the Ukraine, and no doubt with moves against Iran, I think it's fair to say as a senior second-tier neocon, he probably had something to do with the Ukraine as well, which clearly started very much as a coup d'etat, something which, of course, the January 6th protests are not. A coup d'etat presumes that plans have been made, as even he points out, to take over the reins of government. It's a complicated thing. It's not simply a matter of unleashing protesters and then suddenly, by some miracle, you take over the reins of government. That's never going to happen that way, least of all in the United States. But it is interesting. I think the media doesn't care to recognize the significance of his admission. They never do, of course, that the U.S. is and has long been actively involved in stirring up unrest and fomenting coup d'etats around the world and in the various regions, hotspots that come back to trouble us today.
Sure. Stay with us, gentlemen, as we're going to take a look at some online reactions to this development. Our first reaction, Two Bomb writes, "We aren't surprised Bolton violated international laws. We're surprised he admitted it on national TV. American government officials don't typically admit to toppling foreign governments. They hide behind plausible deniability." Bay Area Homeland writes, "Why is anyone surprised? He's not the only one who has committed such plans." Emily Heisen writes, "People knowing that John Bolton has worked in the federal government for decades and surprised that he's helped plan the coup don't know much about American history. The U.S. government is literally always planning coups to overthrow foreign governments. It's what they do." Len Posh writes, "I'm surprised at the reactions to John Bolton's admission about coup d'etats on CNN today. Are people really that unaware of U.S. foreign policy? We do this stuff all the time. Chile, Iraq, Iran, Guatemala, Panama, etc., etc., etc. There's even a massive Wikipedia page on it." And our last tweet, "Many coups in Africa are also planned abroad. John Bolton is the master in planning them. Africans must be careful and do things for themselves for relying on the Western handouts, which make us vulnerable to exploitations and genocides that benefit the Westerners." Let's go back to our guest, Tim Anderson, looking at some of the reactions. Basically, everybody believes that this has happened before by Washington. It's going to happen again. The question is, will Washington and the United States ever be held to account for their actions?
Yes, well, the habitual nature of it is to do, of course, with the fact that there's a de facto impunity to US crimes around the world. And one of the few exceptions, perhaps, has been the treatment of Mike Pompeo recently, where it's well known now that Iran is after him for responsibility for the murder of General Soleimani, for example, and there's also he's wanted for questioning in Spain too. So, but that's very rare occasion. Generally speaking, figures in the US can make these sort of statements, admitting their involvement. Let's remember, it's not just about coups, it's about murdering human beings, murdering sometimes thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of human beings, and get away with it. Where is the accountability? Who is going to stand up to them? And I think that's what comes down to. It will keep on going so long as there is this impunity, so long as there is not a strong state or group of states which say this is enough, we have to hold these individuals accountable.
And same question to Barry Grossman and Bali. Any accountability with regards to the U.S. actions, maybe in the future?
Well, there is none, and there will be none, because there is no court of competent jurisdiction that has standing to hold the United States accountable for the range of war crimes it commits and the range of instances in which it breaks international law. But coming back to this story, I think it's important to remember that this utterance was made in the context of the Muscat doing his bit, Mr. Bolton, to basically see Trump dismissed because, of course, the neoconservative movement prefers now a Democratic Party government. And so he was doing his part. That was a throwaway comment. It was interesting that he made it. It's not surprising. He knows he can say those things without any accountability whatsoever and elevate himself in the process in the eyes of his peers.
All right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. Director of Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies, Tim Anderson, joining us from Sydney, and thanks to political analyst Barry Grossman joining us from Bali. With that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review, but do stay tuned. There's plenty more to come here on Press TV.